Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with a source document that is maybe the most exquisitely bureaucratic and recursively philosophical text we have ever encountered.
That is not an exaggeration.
No, we are diving into a formal inquiry, into an event whose entire singular purpose was to debate its own function.
It's the ultimate administrative paradox, really. The system needed a meeting to figure out if that very meeting was necessary.
Exactly. And the paper we're dissecting is the formal documentation from the Autolatriziology subunit ASU 1138 on the inaugural plenary session of the Conference on Conferencing, the CoC.
The CoC.
And our mission today is not just to read this report, but to actually unpack the dense, frankly opaque sesquipedalian discourse. I mean, the incredibly long, multi-syllable words these academics are using.
Right, because underneath all that complexity, there's a single, really critical debate happening.
Yeah, is the CoC a necessary act of purification? So an essential systemic purification, or is it just foptudalification?
Pretentious, self-serving nonsense.
That's the one. And to cut through it, I think we have to start with the concept that the report itself flags as the source of all the tension. The ontotortuality of event genesis. Okay, let's unpack this immediately, because ontotortuality sounds like a dental procedure gone wrong. What does it mean for an event to have a tortured existence right from the start?
It's a term for a critical internal conflict. A system realizes it needs structure, so it creates an event. In this case, the CoC.
Right.
But the moment that event exists, its job is to turn inward and assess its own reason for being. That mandatory self-critical conflict, that's the ontortuality, the philosophical burden it's born with.
So it's like if you create a department whose only job is to review other departments, its very first task has to be reviewing itself.
And that creates an infinite tortured loop.
Wow.
And this whole session was dedicated to escaping that torture by validating the loop. You know, did they spend all day staring at their organizational navels, or did they actually establish a necessary check on power?
Let's start with the proponents then. The faction arguing that this self-assessment is, in fact, an ineluctable necessity.
This is the team saying, if we don't look inward, the whole thing just collapses.
Right.
They framed the CoC as an ineluctable mandate, meaning it was absolutely required, you couldn't avoid it. They argue that without this conference, the system has no defense against its own inevitable decay.
For them, it provides a critical long-term measurement function.
And they gave that function a name that sounds like it belongs on a starship, desynactimetry.
Okay, so desynactimetry.
It's a very specific term. It means the scheduled, crucial measurement of 10-year cyclic efficiency. So this wasn't about daily tasks. It was about ensuring longevity inside what they called the mucktitudinal client-based interaction layer.
The messy, real-world layer, where the system actually has to connect with people and, get its hands dirty.
Precisely. And they needed this high-level assessment to combat something called systemic neocrepitude.
New creeping decay. Structural rot.
Exactly. The kind of thing that just naturally infiltrates any large, complex operation over time. The CoC, for them, is essentially mandatory preventative maintenance.
And the language they use to defend this it's just breathtaking. Let's start with Professor Zebediah McGilligoon. He was pretty blunt, claiming that questioning the CoC was engaging in ignoratio lente.
Which is that classic logical fallacy, right? Introducing an irrelevant point.
Yeah.
In his view, questioning the conference's existence is the irrelevant point because its existence is the only way to save the system. He saw it as a lex generalis mandate, a fundamental rule for any self-sustaining system.
And he did not pull any punches about the stakes. He warned that failure to convene ensures unmitigated descent into pusillanimicconia at the next fiscal quinquennium mark.
And that's the real fear, isn't it? Pusillanimicconia.
Such a great word.
It's a highly sophisticated term for systemic timidity. A collapse caused not by some huge failure, but by a total lack of structural confidence.
So the system gets so afraid of making a mistake
that it just freezes. It fails to execute its mission. McGilligoon is basically saying, debate our necessity, and we all become too timid to function.
That fear of pusillanimicconia is so relatable. You see that in organizations all the time, just endless cycles of review where no one wants to actually make a decision.
It's the ultimate form of analysis paralysis. But another proponent, Professor Naviyat Farkle, she came at it from a different angle. She described the CoC as a pulchronautical feat of syncretistic delocalization.
A beautiful, impressive act of bringing all these different ideas together in one place.
Yes. And she argued it stabilizes semantic volatility, which is just the problem of keywords losing their meaning over time by applying a pressurized pericrasis.
Whoa, okay. A pericrasis, that root, aperos, has to do with the infinite, right? So a pressurized version sounds like you're using a cognitive hydraulic press.
That's the perfect analogy. She's saying that CoC is this aggressive stabilization effort.
Yeah.
It's designed to just cut through infinite debate and endless complexity. It's the mechanism that says, stop arguing about definitions. This is the official one for the next 10 years.
And this, she claimed, was necessary to repel the cacophylogenetical creep of administrative error.
The noise, the bad logic, the errors that sort of breed and creep into the system's DNA over time, the proponents really saw this whole conference as a necessary high-pressure cleansing.
And then finally, we have Professor Smacky Winkeldink. He was less focused on the system and more on, well, the audience.
Yeah.
He demanded an ETL lapsometry review of the visual muckvicentia.
So a technical review of the presentation materials themselves, the slides, handouts, all of it. He was worried critically about the audience's inherent disjunctuality.
Disjunctuality, I love it. So audience boredom, intellectual fatigue, just not being prepared to digest this incredibly complex debate.
Yes, exactly. He wanted to make sure that telepagrammic anchors, clear, memorable takeaways were deployed to offset that fatigue, to prevent the fopdoodles and dandyprats from confusing genuine apodictic truth with flapdoodle.
That is a very, very high-stakes way of saying, if our slides are boring, the lazy people in the audience will confuse truth with nonsense.
And that's a powerful case they built. You know, self-assessment is essential to fight decay, overcome timidity, and stabilize meaning. But as we know, too much structure can be its own problem.
Which brings us right to segment 2. The opponents of the CoC saw this intense recursion not as salvation, but as an existential threat. They argued that this whole thing risked obnubile aggregacious system failure.
A failure caused by the system becoming so obscured, so hidden within its own bureaucratic mass, that its core mission is just lost.
It's like when the organizational chart gets so complicated, you forget what the company was even supposed to do.
Precisely. They argued that resources, which they called auto-matricent resource cycles, should be pointed at mitigating external mucktivism.
Meaning actually dealing with real-world problems.
Yes. Instead of debating internal formality, they accused the event of being infinitesimania, an obsession with these infinite loops disguised as an intellectual encomium, a platform for self-praise.
Professor Kismo Vandersnoot gave a particularly scathing critique. She said this self-adulation risked a terminal state of aperigomania.
Aperigomania. It's when the system's only output, its only real activity, is the worship of its own process.
Wow.
She warned that if the system only exists to celebrate itself, it has stopped serving any external purpose at all.
That is a phenomenal diagnosis of chronic bureaucracy. She even labeled the whole thing Bernesque overdesign.
Which is academic shorthand for inefficiency driven by too much formality. It's the ultimate meeting about the meeting, a process so layered it just burns up all the resources before any real work gets done.
Vandersnoot's point was crystal clear. You're solving an internal problem at the expense of your actual job.
Right. And meanwhile, Professor Slog-Nobbington, he focused on the intellectual contamination. He argued the sheer volume of logomachycodlism,
The excessive word fighting and chatter,
was creating a turbidum mutterans field.
a dense, cloudy field of organizational noise.
And he claimed this noise was causing hyperbaric overload in the Percepticon logic arrays. Now, this is where the critique gets really interesting. He's arguing the debate isn't just inefficient, it's actively confusing the cognitive core of the system.
So the complexity and jargon are so thick, it's literally jamming the logic circuits.
Exactly. And the reason for this, he concluded, is that the whole conference is just a vehicle for the valetudinalism of the academic ego.
Oof. Valetudinalism. The ego's obsession with its own health and relevance.
That's the ultimate institutional burn.
It is. They're saying your so-called necessity is just your vanity in disguise.
That's the heart of the opposition. They saw the whole thing as a narcissistic plea for funding and self-importance.
And Professor Woogie Pluck, he just brought the whole grim assessment to a head. He said the CoC was a form of ultra-crepidarianism.
Offering opinions outside one's expertise applied to admin oversight. He warned this whole structural debate was leading the entire system directly towards Zugzwangst.
A term from chess, right?
It is. It's a position where any possible move you make is bad for you. If you move, you lose ground. If you stay put, you lose ground.
Organizational gridlock forced by self-reflection.
He's warning that by constantly asking, should we exist, the system traps itself. If they stop debating, they suffer from that neocrepitude, the decay. But if they continue, they suffer from aperigomania and resource drain.
The stakes were, truly existential. So you have these two radically opposed, high-jargon factions. How on earth did ASU 1138 resolve this conflict?
Well, they achieved a consensus rooted in something they called tricyclicality. They basically had to acknowledge the satiricological paradox of the whole thing.
Which is that the debate was both absolutely necessary
and structurally absurd. Both sides were, in a way, simultaneously right.
That is such a beautiful summary of modern organizational life. You need the structure to check the system, but the structure itself risks destroying the system.
Yeah.
So how did they solve it?
Through a compromise delivered by Professor Baphip Glimmerton, he introduced the Limited Aperiphoria Protocol, the LAP.
Okay, the LAP. Tell us about it. What are the limits on this fear of the infinite?
The resolution was surgical and severe. The conference on conferencing will be restricted to a single ephemeral day every decennium.
Every 10 years.
Every 10 years. And crucially, that single day is dedicated only to the heuristicidalism of its own paradigmatic structure, and nothing else.
A mandated decennial purge of self-doubt. Once a decade, they're allowed exactly one day to aggressively critique, even try to destroy and rebuild their own existence.
It's a pre-mortem analysis of the organization itself. This single day satisfies the proponent's need for that desenactimetry, that structural checkup, while preventing the infinitesimania the opponents were so afraid of. It's a formal, temporary release valve for all that internal conflict.
And Professor Bartholomew Plicker gave the binding endorsement for this compromise.
He did. He noted that the solution protects the system from dismutational mania. So, systemic breakdown or uncontrolled mutation. And most importantly, it validated the utility of the debate itself. It stabilized the apeirogon, that underlying structural infinity, without succumbing to it.
So what's fascinating here is the formal conclusion of the report.
It's amazing. It states explicitly that the debate successfully executed its primary function, justifying its own existence. By proving the two opposing views could only be resolved through a formal, structured process, the process itself was proven necessary.
They spent an entire session on this complex, jargon-laced existential debate, and the result is one day of self-critique every 10 years. It's peak bureaucracy, yes, but it's bureaucracy that actually achieved a profound self-sustaining purpose.
The ultimate finding is that the system is now freed, for the next decade anyway, from the ignomigmatism of self-doubt. The utility of the debate was proven by the fact that it happened, which is a perfectly recursive self-justification. It ensures administrative sanity for 10 years.
And this really gets back to what so many organizations struggle with. We've defined these high-level academic fears. The pusillanimicon of systemic timidity, the resource drain of aperigomania, and that existential gridlock of Zugzwangst.
Right, and this inquiry provides a really sophisticated model for overcoming those. They averted collapse by creating the Limited Aperiphoria Protocol, a mandated, structured release valve for internal critique.
It acknowledges that structure is necessary for survival, but that the worship of that structure is a systemic threat.
And this gives you a tool to analyze your own environment. You might be staring at an overly complex process, a meeting that never seems to end, or an org chart that has achieved total obnubile aggregaceous complexity.
The solution wasn't to get rid of the bureaucracy. It was to schedule its essential self-critique rigidly and, well, rarely.
Exactly.
So think about your role or your organization. What processes or habits in your field might be suffering from valetudinalism, the ego of the process demanding its own relevance, when they should be focused on the external mission?
And what structural processes could benefit from a Limited Aperiphoria Protocol? A mandated single day every few years, dedicated entirely to the heuristicidalism of its own structure, just to make sure you're achieving genuine purifaction and not just engaging in elegant fopdudalification.
That is definitely something to chew on until our next deep dive.